All right, we're on. Let's get started before it drops off again. So good evening to all of you. I think we've said hello already, but good evening once again. As always, we thank you for being with the Committee of 100 tonight for what we believe will be a very informative discussion on the critical race theory. We are honored to have a very distinguished panel consisting of Mr. Atif Carney, Mr. Paul Lott, Dr. Avangard Jory, and Ms. Martha Kussinger. Our moderator tonight is Kate Masters. And before I introduce you to Kate, I'd like you to join me if you would. If you'll see a flag over on my left shoulder, I'd like you to join me, please, with the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. All right. Can we start? I pledge allegiance
to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, we want to welcome our members, welcome our community leaders and members of the media who are here with us tonight. Thank you all for being with us. As always, I have to put a plug in for the Committee of 100 and then tell you that we're always looking for new members. If you're so led to become a member of the Committee of 100, please see our website at www.pwc100.org. We're always looking for new members. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening. Kate Masters is an award-winning reporter. She grew up in Northern Virginia, but later moved to the Midwest, where she earned her degree in journalism from the University of Missouri. She spent a year covering gun violence and public health while employed by The Trace in Boston, Massachusetts. While at the News Post in Frederick County, Maryland, she won first place in feature writing and breaking news from the Maryland, Delaware, DC Press Association, and Best in Show for her coverage of the local opioid epidemic, which you know has just been an outstanding story here in Virginia. She currently serves as author with the Virginia Mercury. Kate, you're on.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. And should I introduce our panelists as well and give everyone a sense of what their bios are?
Yes, ma'am. You're going to introduce each of the panelists.
Okay, excellent. Well, tonight we have Atif Carney, who is the former Secretary of the Virginia Department of Education under former Governor Ralph Northam. We have Paul Lott, who is the founder of the National Society for the Advancement of Black Americans. We have Dr. Arvinder, Jory, who is she is the English department chair at the PWCPS Independence Non-Traditional School. And we have Martha Kussinger, who is a Haymarket business owner. And the order in which I introduce the panelists is also the order in which they are going to present tonight. And just to give everyone a sense of the format, the topic of discussion is critical race theory in Prince William County schools. And some panelists will be discussing what, if any, influence they think that CRT has had on the school system and how it's influenced it in a positive light. And two will be discussing what, if any, influence CRT has had and whether it's impacted things in a negative light. And so I think the simplest way is just to begin with Atif. And I understand that he'll be presenting for about 10 minutes.
Sure, Kate, thank you so much. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Prince William 100 for organizing this panel. I know the topic is, well, how is CRT impacting our school systems? And that's a loaded question because are we talking about what happens internally within a school division or state policies? Are we talking about external forces who are imposing this conversation of CRT? So I think we're asking the wrong questions. Some of the things that have been on my mind in the last 4 years that when I served as the Secretary of Education, and in the last 4 months since I've been in another role and departed the position, I've had a lot of conversations with multiple people on both political parties, independents, very different perspectives about this topic. Unfortunately, I mean, I have not been invited to speak about free community college or mental health issues or teacher salaries or even COVID. But I get dozen of invites just like this, and a lot of interviews requests, and I've interviewed with Kate multiple times about CRT. So it's been my dream for 10 years of teaching and 4 years as Secretary of Education that families will finally wake up and start paying attention to education. But I did not imagine that they would do it in this way, in this manufactured crisis of the CRT. It's really, really unfortunate. So there are three things I want to highlight in my presentation. After real careful reflection about talking to a lot of folks, especially who are so worked up about whether CRT is being taught in schools and so forth, it's really difficult to have conversations about something that's really manufactured. It's like talking to people who say, well, elves and unicorns exist, but we really don't have any evidence of it. So I don't mean to sound mean, but that's how I really feel. The second thing I've also heard is we're seeing these mini insurrections of sorts in school boards play out across the country, where people are going and yelling and screaming and threatening school board members, threatening superintendents, threatening educators, asking for recalls and firing and so forth. They're also using terms like with these socialists and communists and so forth. And I've asked folks, well, we in our curriculum teach about socialism and communism, and we even teach about Nazi Germany. And those are really problematic things. As Americans, we really, majority of Americans don't believe in communism and socialism. We really resist that. So why is there no conversations about taking that out of our curriculum? So that's the thing, is that this is some of the questions that come in my mind. And the conclusion that I come up with, and it might not be as simple as this, it's probably more complex and nuanced, but in my observation is that our country, our state, our county of Prince William is dramatically different than it was 10 years ago or 5 years ago. I lived in Prince William before coming into my position for 15 years. I saw the changes. I've been in Virginia for 20 plus years, and I see the changes. That it is becoming more and more diverse. There are many marginalized groups who did not have fair treatment. They're finally getting fair treatment because they're demanding it, whether it's Black or brown people, whether it's immigrants, whether it's different religious groups, whether it's gay or lesbian or trans people. And I feel like that there's a group in America that's really fearful of the change that's happening and really resisting it. And I try to look at everything from a historical lens and try to understand it. And I feel like this is nothing new, nothing unique to this era. It's just a different iteration of what's happened in the past. And some folks will argue, well, it's not a thing just about, and I think this is beyond just white or Black or gender and so forth. Some people will say, well, maybe, there are people of color who are also stepping up, and we have elected officials and active voices saying, well, CRT, they're blaming CRT for other things, and they're really speaking loudly as well. And the reason I bring that up is because I'm looking at things through a historical context, and I was born in Pakistan, and I grew up in a family that's very cognizant of the colonial rule. And there were folks, when the British Empire was expanding, these Rajas and Maharajas who sold out. And because of their self-interest, they did not care about the greater good. To advance their own self-interest, they caved in to the people who were in power. And I think this is what's happening in America. And my father and uncle are Republicans, and I don't want to make this about Democrats or Republicans, but they were very disappointed many years ago when I decided to get involved in civic engagement, and I did it through the Democratic Party. And they called their friends in Prince William and tried to talk me out of it. As a matter of fact, elected officials who were Republicans said, hey, Atif, you're a veteran, you're a teacher, you're Muslim, your community is big on conservative values, join our party. And I did feel that because there were not a lot of Black and brown people, that I could be more successful politically, but I didn't want to sell my soul to the devil. This is a problem right now in America. The biggest threat to America right now is nothing external, it's internal. It's the hate, the vitriol that is built up in one part of America that's being propagated through Fox News and so forth. And it's rotten to the core in one party. And I don't want to make this about Democrats or Republicans. I have significant issues with the Democratic Party as well. I've stood up to a lot of problems, but we cannot just push our problems under the rug. We have systemic oppression, inequality, and unfair systems, and we cannot continue to ignore them. So this whole thing with critical race theory, is it impacting our schools? Externally, it definitely is. Those people who have manufactured this crisis have made that clear. They're talking to their children about this, and children are coming in confused, or they're coming in and they're being brainwashed at home and coming in and bullying. I can tell you in Prince William County right now, there are Black and brown children who are bullied. That there are gay, lesbian, trans kids who are bullied because of the nonsense they hear outside. That's why we need to address these issues collectively as a community in a thoughtful way. And whenever people try to do that, they're resistant to that, resistance to change. So that's the problem. Back to you, Kate.
Thanks, Atif. And we're going to move now to Paul Lott, who again is the founder of the National Society for the Advancement of Black Americans. And so Paul, you have the floor, take it away.
Okay, well, you have like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I have to figure out how to share a screen.
At the bottom of your, does it not come up
There we
share
go.
screen?
There we go.
Okay.
Just-
And I will say when 30 seconds, Atif didn't use all his time. I'll let you know when you have 30 seconds left.
Okay. One quick second. This thing is just, so at the bottom, okay, I see it. I don't think this is gonna let me do it.
I haven't started timing. What you can do is you pull up whatever it is you want to share on your computer.
Got it, okay.
And then when
Good now?
click share screen, you go look for that on whatever you're trying to share and click.
Okay.
There you go. You did it.
Yeah, it was bouncing me back and forth. So anyway, so as you know, my name is Paul Lott. Quick background, I founded an ed tech firm about 13 years ago. I've been working as an education advocate for about 30 years. I used to take every 7th year off to volunteer in some of the worst school systems in the country, Chicago, up in Massachusetts, Mattapan, Roxbury, et cetera, et cetera. And I was raised in the Black community. I understand critical race theory. I have worked with academics in talking about critical race theory. And I think that when we talk about critical race theory not existing within the Prince William County school system, I think that either you don't understand critical race theory and what it's about. So I presented to the Racial and Social Justice Commission, and we openly talked about CRT tenets, and the entire session can be seen online. The debate has been whether or not CRT is taught in Prince Williams County. It's not taught in Prince Williams County. It's being implemented in Prince Williams County and made an integral part of the lessons that are delivered and services, et cetera, et cetera. So these are just a couple examples. And this is just on the Prince William County website. That Dr. Andrew, I can't boot height, the principal at Claywood Elementary, formed an advisory board, racial equity. They put together a book club, and How to Be an Anti-Racist is on there. Black Wall Street's on there. Sun Does Shine. How is that related to CRT? The thing you have to understand is that anytime you see the word anti-racist, Anti-racism is CRT's solution, remedy for quote unquote systemic racism and white privilege. So the word CRT or critical race theory doesn't have to be used. The word anti-racism has no meaning outside of the context of the core tenets of CRT. And so it does in fact exist in the school system. Virginia Association for Family and School Consumer Sciences, Carrie Hicks, she served the school's lead. She serves as the school's lead culturally aware, responsive educator, and she provides cultural awareness and anti-racism training to the staff. That is taken from the Prince William County website. Just in a casual search, I was able to find 72 pages on the Prince William County website referring to CRT principles, specifically anti-racism or concepts around that, such as bias, et cetera, et cetera. So the district assumes that race is a significant issue while failing to present any comparative data. In other words, the conversation of race comes up with regards to Prince William County as significant, and what they don't do is present counter data. In other words, what are the number of racial incidents between kids? How many kids are getting into trouble, getting into fights because they don't like fat kids, skinny kids, tall kids, whatever. Kids do what kids do. However, if you scour through the website of Prince William County, it is heavily weighted in terms of race. And then finally, this is actually taken from, if you see the Prince William School Systems Office of Professional Learning, Maria Burgess, okay? And this is this chart in the back was part of the cultural competency training. And this cultural competency training, this was one of the handouts of one of the pieces of materials that was used during the cultural competency training last year. And it specifically states that it's based on critical race theory. And I have I'm gonna say about 3 dozen documents from the Prince William County cultural competency training that talks about, that refers to critical race theory tenets in some way or another. So it should be settled. It's there whether anyone wants to call it that or not, right? I did the presentation to the Social Justice Commission, and it exists despite the fact that, and this is from their report, they state, we did not find any systemic structural discrimination or social injustice. And that was in their examination of education in Prince William County. And that was the Social Justice Commission majority report. That is a line lifted directly from it. And that line is directly from the presentation that I gave to them, going through the evidence of how race is not playing a significant factor in education. So Prince William County is just assuming that the race narrative is true. The Prince William County website has 8,320 entries on race. I would submit that the fact that the commission found race not to be a factor, but the Prince William County school website has 8,300 references to race on their website, I would say that CRT has had a significant influence on the narrative, the discussion in the Prince William County. And this predates, many of these documents predate a lot of the broader discussions in the media, et cetera, et cetera. So let's take a broad look of what is CRT, and maybe that will help. You know, a technical definition is that CRT began as a movement in law and has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many scholars of the field of education consider themselves critical race theories who use CRT's ideas to understand issues of school discipline, hierarchy, tracking, affirmative action, high-stakes testing, controversies of curricula, history, multilingual and multicultural education, and alternative and charter schools. Now, this, in my exploration of critical race theory, I read through the Delgado books, and then I spent 6 weeks going through all of the references and researching its role in education, et cetera, et cetera. So Foundations of Critical Theory in Education, this is a widely read book. It's a widely referenced book in education, in teacher colleges, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea that it's a legal theory is just not true. CRT and education writers discuss the rise of biological racism, education theory and practice, and urge attention to resegregation of American schools, safe rooms, safe places, et cetera. Some questions of Anglo-centric curricula, and many charge that educators apply a deficit theory approach to schooling for minority kids. And deficit theory means the education posits that students who differ from the norm in a significant way should be considered deficient, and that the education process must correct for these deficiencies. And that's where we see minimal grades, where you can't fail a class, where you see all of these put in place to prop up the numbers and outputs for minority candidates. What they don't realize is one side is saying we're doing this to help them with their disadvantage, but it carries with the assumption that these children cannot perform with the mainstream and that they're inherently inferior. So the CRT tenets, just trying to do further definition. The first thing is that racism is everywhere and bias is universal. And if you look on the Prince William County School site and other sites, this is absolutely a position, because racism is assumed and no data is presented to show that it is a significant or controlling factor in academics, right? So this is from the Dalgatti book. First, racism is ordinary and not aberrational. It's normal science, the usual way science does business. Society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. So that's an assumption that has never been proven. But if you read material in the Prince William County website, you will see, and training materials, you will see that that is an underlying assumption that the systemic racism exists and bias is everywhere. Otherwise, if it was the exception, you would not in fact teach it to all students or train all teachers for an exception. So obviously the system assumes that this is preeminent and that white privilege exists. Second, most would agree that our system of white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both psychic and material, for most people. So those are the two pieces. Those things are there. Those things exist in the system. Critical race theory is not based on data or science or outcomes. It is an assumption that, looking through the lens of race, I say, I'm going to assume
30
that
seconds.
racism is everywhere. How 30 seconds? I'm going to assume that racism is everywhere. And I'm going to create systems and responses assuming that the racism exists without any material proof. And that is exactly what happens when you have 8,320 pages on the Prince William County School site talking about race. Thank you.
Very good. Stop.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Paul. And now we are going to move to Dr. Arvinder Jory, who again is the chair of the English department of Prince William's Independence Non-Traditional School. So Dr. Jory, if you want to take it away.
Thank you.
Dr. Jory, before you start, we need to unshare the screen here.
Sure.
Oh, there we go.
Thank you.
I thought it was done already because it like popped back. Sorry.
All right. Good evening, and thank you for spending the evening with us. My presentation is going to be from a practitioner's lens, and I'll focus on culturally responsive teaching. Well, the acronym CRT, which gets erroneously conflated with critical race theory. And this emerged in 1990s. Gloria Ladson-Billings introduced this concept of culturally responsive teaching. She viewed it as a way to maximize students' academic achievement by integrating their cultural references in the classroom. And it responds to challenges and opportunities posed by the presence of social cultural diversity. And culturally responsive instructors do not trivialize cultural differences. They're reflective and they're aware of their own biases. and how these may affect interactions with their students. And they have knowledge of institutional barriers that prevent some cultural groups from accessing resources. And they also have the capacity to tolerate ambiguity. So CRT incorporates critical literacy, which according to Luke, asks students to both deconstruct text, which means to critically analyze how they represent inequities in our society, and reconstruct them back by discovering new possibilities, new perspectives, and new opportunities. So our students' lives are shaped by history, politics, you name it, but by engaging our students with difficult subjects that are intertwined with their lives is a tenet of CRT. So I teach at Independence and non-traditional school, and I would like to share one of my class profiles just to give you a framework of the diversity in regards to my student population. 6 students identify as female, 8 as male. 2 students have IEPs. 1 has a diagnosis of ADHD. 1 is a student with autism whose accommodations require the option to access all assignments digitally. 1 student has a 504 whose accommodations require assignments to be broken into smaller chunks. 3 students are English language learners with levels 2, 3, and 5. And 4 students speak a language other than English at home. And we know that PWCS is a majority minority school system. And the percentage of minority students in 2021-22 was 72%, while the percentage of minority employees was 37%. And CRT demands that we build the capacity of diverse students and focus on academic achievement. And it's imperative that we incorporate text that authentically represent marginalized voices and acknowledge one's own implicit biases, and that analyze the class climate from the lens of power positionality. And we are able to transfer and distribute authority among students and co-create spaces of courageous dialogue. Zareta Hamid, who's the author of Culturally Responsive Teaching and Brain, speaks about a few misconceptions about CRT. She delineates between multicultural education and CRT. Multicultural education is a celebration of diversity, inclusion, harmony, while CRT is about accelerating learning and understanding that cultural artifacts are not a cognitive scaffold. She also mentions that a trusting relationship is critical, but it's not enough. Instruction needs to be made culturally responsive through differentiation and inquiry. There is often an assumption made that scholarship and academia are necessarily drudging endeavors and can be taught in a space devoid of relational and empathetic components. But CRT is built on the core tenet of empathetic rigor. We need to minimize stress levels. We need to create a safe space for our students. We need to honor their ways of learning, and we need to leverage their cultural lexicon to take them to another level. At this point, I would like to share 2 of my students' writings that highlight the criticality of implementing culturally responsive teaching. What I remember most about Leslie is her radiant smile and her furious scribbles and notes on margins of articles. She had immigrated to the United States 3 years prior to attending my English 10 class. She was ELL level 2 and found writing cumbersome, laborious, and difficult. And this is what she wrote in response to a writing prompt about describing a metaphor for one's own writing identity. My writing is like pushing a turtle to run faster because I used to write in English. It's so hard to me, but meanwhile, I like to write because it helps me to learn more English. And I'm proud of my writing and also to become a good writer of English. English is so important here in USA because if you don't learn to write or read, you are seen like you are nothing here. My writing is like pushing a turtle to run faster, also because when I start to write in English, I have first to think in Spanish and then put in English, because if I don't first think in Spanish, I feel like I don't know what I'm writing in English. I know that's so difficult and hard for me. I don't know how to say words that are so hard to say. I'm so shy to say because when I was in another school, I was there where some students laughed at my pronunciation. And I say to me, nobody is perfect and no one came to this world knowing everything. And I also wanted to share Philly's poem about his writing persona. I remember that he used to sing with his church choir at his Baptist church on Sundays. He was chronically tardy and frequently stayed a few minutes after his class ended to chat about his music passion. To handle my aggression, mainly negative, you live in a bad community, you curse somebody out, mom and dad separated, makes me more mad. Writing is your business, not for public, just like to be by myself. Basement, freestyle in the mind, 2 hours of writing, go back and act like nothing happened. Want to hear proper words? You go get a book. In a writing class, I write fake. Teachers tell me write 6 paragraphs, not 2. They take it over the top. Write this, write that, write this, write that. Got to be sad or mad. One of them. You can't be happy in writing. There's no point. As life goes on, I'll probably live better. I want a writing club with serious writers who walk out of it not feeling happy. After reading these responses, I felt compelled to reflect on my ability to navigate their experiential alienation and their complex narratives fraught with power differentials. And, students begin to doubt their literacy identities and also fear deviating from institutional and class expectations. And I also wanted to mention that according to Holm, literacy identities constructed across different, often intersecting and antagonistic discourses, practices, and positions morph into disengaged writers. And that becomes
30 seconds.
Antithetical to CRT. So this co-creation of discourse and tension spaces with the objective of interrogating equity issues is imperative to elevating the discourse to a social construct. And we need to ask, who has access? How do we understand our embodiment of privilege and operation, both historical and current? And how do we empower our students without becoming the savior authority? And I continue to reflect on, who are my students? Who am I? And what do I carry into my classroom? Thank you.
Very good stuff.
Thank you, Dr. Jory. And last, we are going to move to Martha Cutzinger, who is a Haymarket business owner. So Martha, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm sorry, but my cats have invaded my room, so I hope that I can keep them away from me now that I'm ready to go here. All right, I need to do a couple of housekeeping things. Hold on. Okay, thank you. I'm going to demonstrate how critical race theory and critical social justice are intrinsic to culturally responsive instruction, as we are just starting to implement both here in Prince William County. Turning classrooms into laboratories for social justice is the stated goal. The evidence is in the sources used by Prince William County schools. I have to move fast. I have a lot of information, so please stay with me. As Paul noted, understanding the tenets and language of critical race theory are key to teaching it within schools. Race, oppression or oppressed, people of color, US is systemically racist, all to retain power for white people. Here is CRT, a CRT definition from one of the co-founders that Paul referenced earlier, Richard Delgado, and his definitive book, Critical Race Theory, 3rd edition. And he notes, critical race theory questions the very principles of constitutional law. Delgado questions the validity of free speech rights, and that's actually the foundation to cancel culture today. In 2009, he gave an interview on the 20th anniversary of the founding of critical race theory. He notes, I was a member of the founding conference, 24 of us, mentions Kimberly Crenshaw. She later created intersectionality that year. And he says, so we gathered at the convent for 2.5 days, an odd place for a bunch of Marxists. Most of us went on to become prominent critical race theorists: Kim Crenshaw, Mary Matsuda, Charles Lawrence, Derek Bell. Please remember those names. He goes on to say how proud he was that critical race theory had infiltrated education to the extent that it had. He says, teachers believe that they treat their students equally. Of course, the outcome figures show that they do not, because critical race theory looks at outcomes because it's based on Marxism. On to operational equity. It is, oh, my slide is there. Equity takes the exact resources to reach an equal outcome. The disingenuous claim is that equity is about opportunity, but as Delgado notes, outcomes are the measurement. Critical race theory teaches that any disparate outcome between races is solely due to racism, and diversity and inclusion are the tools of critical race theory used to achieve equity. I'm going to move on to Prince William County's equity sources. This is how they claim that it informs their sources that inform everything that they do equity related. When you go to the equity resources, they give links that take you specifically to the VDOE Ed Equity Guide. And you'll see here that the Ed Equity Guide is doing the work for equity, justice, and anti-racism. That is critical race theory language. They use sources for their Ed Equity Guide, and they name them here. But for the purpose of time today, we're going to only focus on Dr. Kendi, Dr. Bettina Love, Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, and Teaching Tolerance, which is now called Learning for Justice. First, Dr. Kendi, Paul alluded to him as well. He's our anti-racism source from his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. If discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. Further in the book, he notes, to love capitalism is to end up loving racism. To love racism is to end up loving capitalism. And off to the right, he notes, capitalism is essentially racist. This is Dr. Bettina Love from her, in her own words, and she is also a Prince William County source and a VDOE source.
And then when we can destroy them, we're going to keep destroying. So destroying capitalism is a part of our freedom dream. It's a part of the long-term goal. But
when she's not focusing on K through 12 education, she is focusing on abolishing prisons and police, along with Angela Davis. This is Dr. Love's website. It's abolitionistteachingnetwork.org. She actually coined the term Abolitionist Teaching Network. She's a strong advocate for abolishing police and prisons and removing resource officers from schools. On to Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. She's again been referenced a couple of times tonight. This is her 1995 paper, Toward a Critical Race Theory in Education. This paper is the genesis of what will become culturally responsive instruction. And in the second sentence, the article argues for a critical race theoretical perspective in education. She goes on to pay homage to Marxism and Marxist theory. She notes that democracy can exist without capitalism, and notes that capitalism is pernicious and is full of structural inequities. But her sources for this paper, you will note, are all of the names mentioned by Richard Delgado. He's cited multiple times: Kimberly Crenshaw, Marie Matsuda, Derek Bell, and Charles Lawrence. And also, not necessarily mentioned here, but she also uses Brazilian Paulo Freire as her framework for culturally responsive instruction. The evidence is undeniable. Culturally responsive instruction is the implementation of critical race theory ideology into K through 12 education. And Ibram Kendi taught us that to be an anti-racist, one must be anti-capitalist and one must accept discrimination through equity. And now I'm jumping back to the Ed Equity Guide that Paul alluded to earlier. I'm going to focus on a couple of things. Those sources, I'm going to reiterate that because it's important. This webinar was done last March, and it was specifically about what is culturally responsive instruction. Again, our own Maria Burgos was the facilitator. So as Paul noted, the sources at the bottom, Critical Race Theory Today, third edition, and a publication called Critical Race Theory Today. The third column on that slide defines what is a culturally responsive classroom. And here she clearly states, social agents for change, advocating for the rights for all global members of society. That kind of classroom or teacher addresses systemic barriers to institutional racism. They will be allies with learning institutions in combating all forms of social oppression. This is all critical race theory language because critical race theory is the source. Also in the webinar is a slide giving homage to Brazilian Marxist Paulo Freire and his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And in this webinar, teachers are encouraged to read this book. Socialistworker.org informs us that Freire was in a constant battle for social justice and socialist revolution because Freire was a Marxist, and that inequality and injustices of the capitalist system is everywhere evident in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the book that Virginia teachers are encouraged to read. And as an aside, Paulo Freire was a fan of Mao, and he thought that Mao's Cultural Revolution was the right playbook. Finally, the last source that I'm focusing on today from Prince William County is Learning for Justice, used to be Teaching Tolerance. Learning for Justice is the education arm of the Southern Poverty Law Center. You go to their website and there's lots of content and lesson plans for teachers to be able to use. They are all based on race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual identity, social justice, etc. This one for grades level 6 through 8 tells students to write a letter to Ernesto explaining the concepts of intersectionality, privilege, and oppression. Off to the right, for young white students only, and this is for grades level kindergarten through 5. This is to help to go in a long way in advancing their anti-racist white identity. Again, this is the source that Prince William County and VDOE claim is one of their Ed Equity Guide sources. All of this, and now I'm back to the Virginia Ed Equity Guide, all of this is to create culturally responsive educators. These teachers will be required to mediate power imbalances in the classroom based on race, culture, ethnicity, gender, and class. And they will be evaluated on their ability to do that. Mediate power imbalances in the classroom. Now we're jumping to Prince William County School Strategic Plan unveiled and voted on last month. The point here is that, and by the way, this plan embraces culturally responsive instruction and social emotional learning, and is promised at all grade levels by 2024-2025. So this is our future. The framework will be provided by CASEL, which is Collaborative for Social Emotional Learning. You go to CASEL's website, and they will tell you that they are for promoting justice-oriented civic engagement, which they call transformative SEL, and that this form of SEL is aimed at redistributing power to promote social justice through increased engagement in school and civic life. Further, CASEL will tell you that they will mitigate educational, social, and economic inequities that derive from the interrelated legacies of racialized cultural oppression, issues such as power, privilege, prejudice, discrimination, and social justice. 100% critical race theory ideology. Now I'm back to Prince William County website and their preschool curriculum. They note that they use high scope, second step, and conscious discipline. Second step references CASEL, which we just talked about, and Learning for Justice, which we just talked about. And conscious discipline notes that they use transformational social and emotional learning, which is CASEL. Finally, once one understands the goals, the ideology, the tenets, the language, and the social justice activism goals of critical race theory, one understands they are intrinsic to culturally responsive instruction and social emotional learning. You cannot separate the two. They are now our future with last year's full embrace of equity. And whether or not you agree with CRT tenets is not the point, that it is Marxism focused on activism and not academics. I'll just repeat that it is Marxism focused on activism and not academics is irrefutable. That is all.
All right, thank you, Martha. And now we're going to move on to the portion of the evening where we're going to do a Q&A with questions that have been developed by the committee over the past few weeks. Any panelists can chime in, but just make sure not to cut each other off and to stay civil. And I think moving on to the first question, which I think is a really important one, what is your definition of critical race theory, and what are the sources for your definition?
I'll hop in. My definition of critical race, well, not my definition, the definition of critical race theory, it's a body of knowledge and vocabulary developed around the notion that America is systemically racist, that systemic racism leads to a system of white privilege and general bias, and that the only way to mitigate the effects of this bias is to practice anti-racism. Color blindness is seen as an obsolete idea and saying that it's ignoring a problem, and that bias or racism by whites is both conscious and unconscious. And therefore, because of these unconscious biases, unless the majority race or oppressor, as they say, consciously counteracts those instincts, that they will by de facto oppress the minority, and that racism can only be assigned to the majority because racism incorporates implied power in order for it to be racism. That's in general. I could go more specifically, but I think that was kind of covered in the slides. From a very simple statement is it's just a point of view is all it is. It started out in legal circles as to say, okay, if this black kid robs a drugstore, how about if I assume that racism is involved, that influences his life, that it's everywhere, that led to these behaviors? And these kind of play scenarios were used to figure out alternate ways of prosecution and punishment, et cetera, and it just evolved into a whole science. But it's just to say, assume this is true and see what happens. Like, assume the boogeyman's true. Let's talk about it in form of vocabulary, or that Jedis exist. It was the same category of things.
And we're going to move to Atif now, who has his hand raised.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. I'm going to answer the question a little bit differently because critical race theory definition, is there. Mr. Lott referenced the true definition of it. In addition to critical race theory, there's also critical gender theory. There's critical theory in general, and that's where a lot of the other theories branched out. So there's critical class and economics theory. Basically, the whole concept of critical theory in general is that there are some groups of people who are at a disadvantage versus others. It can be applied anywhere in the world. Dynamics are very different. In the situation that we are in, we're obviously talking about race and so forth. And it was referenced that what data exists or what doesn't exist. My question or thinking behind this is that school discipline, if you look at suspension rates and if you look at expulsion rates, they're 3 times as likely for Black children compared to their peers in Prince William County. And this is a study that was commissioned by a Republican majority even before I got into office and Governor Northam came into office. So there are data sets, and that's just one example why is that? So to really understand why is that, and to get to the bottom of it, you have to think differently so you can address the needs of all children thoughtfully. That's just one data set. So there's multiple data sets that exist that clearly show, but we're not asking the right questions. We shouldn't be asking what is critical race theory. We should be asking is why are certain people so worked up about it? Look, I mean, this is a backlash to people asking for fair treatment, to what's happening with police brutality or other modern day school segregation. People are asking for fair treatment. And this is just another iteration of the histories of the past where there's a backlash, this vitriolic and hateful. Let's just be honest here.
90 seconds are up.
All right. And are we going to allow responses by panelists who have already spoken, or would you prefer to allow panelists who haven't spoken to go first?
Cynthia? I would
Well-
say get all the people, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, allow everyone to respond to the question.
Okay,
Yeah,
Once.
please.
okay. Well, Martha or Dr. Jory, do you want to jump in? Before Paul, I see he has his hand raised.
Do you need to have the question repeated? Kate, maybe you could repeat the question that they're being asked to respond to?
Sure. The question, just as a reminder to everyone, is what is your definition of critical race theory and what are the sources for your definition? And Martha, did you want to chime in?
Well, I don't want to take my time going through the definition of critical race theory because I think I kind of covered that in my presentation and what my sources are, and my sources are the founders, as like Paul. I just want to respond a little bit to something Secretary said, and that is that he did bring up critical theory. I'm glad he did. That is the basis. It comes from the Frankfurt School. I am a broken record on Marxism. It is not just about fairness. It's about dismantling and deconstructing. Those words have been used already tonight. Dismantling and deconstructing Western culture. Critical theory is Marxism, period. And every form of it, critical race theory, critical gender theory, critical queer theory, all the studies that come out of it in academia, it is all based on Marxism to dismantle Western culture because they are socialists. It is to usher in socialism. I, as an American, I don't want that. So do I fear it? I don't want it to happen, and I think it's winning. So.
And Martha, before I go to Dr. Jory, we did have a question from the audience just asking what your experience in education is. The question goes, is she an educator or has she ever worked in a school system? And I just wanted to give you the chance to respond because I introduced you as a business owner.
Oh, that's well, and frankly, Denny added that. Denny, you can fess up to that, because if we're talking about identity, I do not identify as a business owner. I have a small business, but I do not identify as that. I identify as a mom. I was a stay-at-home mom. My business was secondary. I spent hours and hours and hours, countless hours in school, from preschool through 12th grade, volunteering, PTAs, you name it. And then I was a substitute for a little bit. So my only experience in education is as a parent and a little bit as a substitute.
Gotcha. And Dr. Jory, did you want to respond to this question?
Well, I just want to say that it's really not relevant to my practitioner's lens, so I'll pass.
Okay, great. And Atif, you have your hand raised.
Just a 15-second comment, if that's okay, Kate.
Sure.
And I don't think you have to be an educator to care about education, right? Dr. Jari and I are credentialed, but I think families, business owners, it doesn't matter. If you care, you care. But my question is that I agree. I mean, I don't want our society to be dismantled. I am opposed to Marxism and communism, but we teach that in school. We teach those theories in school. So that's what I'm saying, is that's why I'm confused, is that in our curriculum, we have taught for decades about socialism, communism, Nazi Germany, and so forth. So why this obsession with critical race theory? It just really messes with I just don't get it.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to
Mr. Lott.
Yeah, we're going to move to Paul, and then I think we'll move on to the next question. So Paul, go ahead.
I can tell you why it's a big deal to me. I was raised in poor Black communities, 100% Black communities. I have the stripes to prove it. Stabbed at 9 years old, almost bled out. Arm broken by a bunch of white kids that tried to beat me to death when I was in the kindergarten. I've lived it. I've lived this life, and I still ended up making it to Harvard. And I can tell you for a fact that the principles of critical race theory have always been accepted by the Black community for as long as I've been alive. And that though the idea that America is systemically racist and against you is the #1 gang recruiting message in every single city that I have worked in. I have used my own money to spend a year in some of the most violent school systems in this country, working with students. And the #1 thing that I have to fight is this notion of systemic racism, white privilege, and the conclusion they put is, Why work so hard in education to get educated if you can just sell this drug, join this gang, do this? That's why it's important. This message is destructive to Black Americans, period. That's why we came out against it. And as for data, Black cultures are different. To say that the data says that Black Americans or minorities are how should we discipline more often? You need to come back and prove that there are instances of undisciplined white activity before that number means anything. Sometimes the reason why Blacks are more disciplined is because they commit more offenses. There are almost 7,000 murders that take place of Blacks, and 6,600 are murders of Black on Black. So we have to look at it's too complicated to go into here, but the tenets are wrong. And there's a difference between teaching that socialism is X or communism is X, as opposed to training your teachers to spot bias, racism, where you have no data to show that bias is the problem. I presented data to the Prince William County Racial and Social Justice Commission. The data shows from 2008 that all of this racial nonsense, Prince William County is a model in terms of the academic performance that it has pulled out of its minority students. It should be a model for the nation, and none of it involved race-based education.
Okay, I think that is a good amount of time for that question. We have a lot to go through.
Sorry.
No. Just want to keep things moving along. And so the next one is, please explain the difference between critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and culturally responsive instruction as they relate to Prince William County schools. So a lot of terms that sort of get included in this debate. And so if panelists could explain the difference between them, that would be great. And if y'all want to raise your hands, that'll help me just determine the order to go in.
I'll take a shot if nobody else wants to take a shot.
Okay, let's go to Martha and then to Atif.
Okay, and I'm wondering if that question was presented before each of us had our 10 minutes. Was that one of the questions that was submitted ahead of the discussion? Because I covered some of that in my presentation, but culturally responsive instruction.
It was.
Oh yeah, okay. So that makes sense to me. But the way that I explain culturally responsive instruction is that there are all kinds of levels of academic critical studies, even critical fat studies today, race studies, Latinx studies, gender studies, queer studies. That's all critical theory. It's all critical study. It's all based on Marxism. It's all designed to dismantle Western culture. It's heavy in academia. Culturally responsive instruction is the redesign of those things to be able to be injected into K through 12 education. So Atif, your dad might say, my kid was conservative until he went to college, right? You'll hear a lot of conservative parents say that. That is now what will be happening in K through 12 education. And you're already seeing it being played out. Last week in Alexandria, 6 high schools walked out because they decided that their new superintendent wasn't left-wing enough. So that's what the social activism, culturally responsive instruction, social emotional learning is doing to K through 12 education. It's teaching kids that their academics aren't as important as oppressed identities, helping oppressed identities, what their gender is, what their pronouns are, is there accommodation here for everything? That is what culturally responsive instruction will train them to do. As far as diversity and inclusion, equity is the goal, because equity, you can think of as socialism. It's redistribution, it's reparations in action. Diversity is creating an environment where marginalized identities are included in the space, whether that's a board or a class or employment or whatever. And then inclusion is making so that those diverse identities feel safe in those spaces.
Okay. Thank you. And now we're going to move on to Atif.
Thank you, Kate. And again, I think we're not asking the right questions. Are critical race theory, DEI, other things, how are they tied and so forth? Some will say they're tied really closely together. Some might not. I think we need to ask the right questions, but I want to respond to Ms. Cutzinger, is that there was a moment in time where a high school student, 16-year-old Barbara Johns in Virginia, when schools were segregated, walked out and organized the thing without her principal or her parents knowing, which eventually led to the Brown v. Board of Education, the famous case, which ultimately ended school segregation. And then Virginia had a backlash, like we're seeing here with the CRT nonsense, of massive resistance. So social activism is fully integrated for generations in the fabric of America, which has really led to some positive changes. Now, I'm not going to talk specific to every single case. I'm not justifying that, hey, every single thing done in every single school is appropriate or accurate, but why is that a bad thing? Don't we want to encourage our young people to express their frustrations with something? Don't we value freedom of expression? So it's really counterintuitive, where on one hand, I'm saying, hey, don't limit our expression with this cancel culture stuff, but then when people are speaking out, you want to suffocate their voices. So I'm just kind of confused again, like, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, thanks, Atif. And we're going to move on to Paul, who has his hand raised.
The answer to that is this: schools are put in place to academically prepare our children for life after school. That's it. When that child leaves that school, they should be proficient in reading, writing, and math. Our children are leaving the school, they're not proficient in reading, writing, and math. And economic resources directed towards, I'm going to call them side social projects of any kind, race and education, whatever it is. If anything that goes beyond that detracts from a child's education, and if you don't think that currying to a child's every emotional whim is not a distraction from academic performance, you're just wrong. There is no study, no data anywhere that says that by catering to a child's emotional whims, I'm going to call them, and by involving them in all of this social activity, that it improves their outcomes. It is not the school's responsibility to do these things. The school's responsibility is to make sure that my child can read. And when my child cannot read, but feels the need to protest, the school has failed me.
Mhm.
Thanks, Paul. And Dr. Jory, do you want to go ahead? Mhm.
Yeah, I would. So, I would like to leverage my proximity to students, because I do get the opportunity to listen to their narratives and their sub-narratives, which are layered. And they are the ones who demand that rigor. And, when we talk about social projects, it definitely entails a deep dive into honest education. We don't want to give them these single narratives, but we want to give them this holistic and honest understanding of history, of the current times, of what they are really, dealing with. And if we try to sideline that, I think we are taking a huge chunk of relevant experiences from them. And we owe it to them. I think we are obliged to bring in all the narratives and all the intersections and intersectionality of, race, of socioeconomic milieu, and their backgrounds, their prior knowledge, their gaps in understandings, relevance gaps, opportunity gaps, and then tie it all into our instruction and figure out how we are going to reach each one of them.
Time's up.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sherry. And just for future questions, do we want to give everyone a chance to respond, or do we want to allow all four panelists to answer and then move on to the next question?
We'd like to have each person respond to the question if possible.
Okay. And has anyone not responded to this one? I just saw that Paul had his hand up again, so wanted to make sure how you'd like things to go.
to respond to that, that's fine. Just everyone gets an answer. My only comment was that the schools have kids 5 hours a day. They cannot do all that stuff that was just said. And being a person that's been in education, either as an executive of developing systems or in the schools themselves, I can tell you that teachers don't want to do all of that. They want to be able to teach. They want to have the time to teach and deliver the material. If I have one teacher and 20 kids in the class, I cannot be all to each kid. American education was created to focus on those things that were common to all Americans and all children. We didn't have public education for our first 154 years of the country. It was formed in a response to the massive immigration of the early 1900s as specifically a place to focus only on that which all of us had in common so that we could develop a common culture and common American identity. This trend that's going on today is reversing the very purpose that schools were historically founded to combat. You can have diversity at home with your parents. Italians, Irish, other groups get this training from their parents. You know, Blacks, we're the only people that really demand that public education teach our situation, which should come from our parents, to everybody, even though we're 13% of the population. It doesn't make sense.
Can we stop?
Yeah. I see that Atif has his hand raised, but I'm going to move on to.
Oh, my hand's not raised. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And hopefully, and we'll let everyone respond to the next one. And hopefully, Atif, you can tie it into your response to that one. Great. Okay. And the third question we have, do you think critical race theory is being couched in any other form to allow teaching in Prince William County schools? And let's start with Atif because he had his hand raised last.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question one more time?
Yeah. So the question is, do you think critical race theory is being couched in any other form to allow teaching in Prince William County schools? And I think what's meant by that is, do you think that, there are different phrases being used or it's being called different things, to sort of let it into the classroom?
I mean, we clearly know what Ms. Kutzinger and Mr. Lott will say, and I think it's pretty clear what Dr. Jory and myself will say, that, some will say there is a hidden agenda and, there's this movement by Marxists to destroy America, right? And I don't believe that the case because, being Secretary of Education who implemented a lot of this stuff, I mean, I'm not Marxist. I mean, I'm a combat veteran who, came in crossfire from my country and I love my country. I mean, it's like, here's the thing, and we're not going to philosophically agree because people have made up their mind, right, on two sides of this issue. It has become hyper-politicized and so forth. But
Time's up.
Okay, 5 seconds. One thing that I will emphasize is that in order to really understand the significant issues of oppression in our country, I think we just need to reflect on our one's owns and what are our motives? Why are we so fired up about this? And what are their own personal agendas? Because again, like I said earlier, that this is much deeper than just a debate about CRT.
Thanks, Atif. And we're going to move on to Martha now.
I again, reiterating culturally responsive instruction, social emotional learning, yes, that is critical race theory. But beyond that, Paulo Freire is the Marxist that really has had the most influence on public education, starting with academia, filtering down to K through 12 education. His book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, his follow-on book, Politics of Education, is absolutely the foundation of K through or of public education today. He taught that students needed to be politicized. They needed to have their conscious awakened, woke, and that you could teach them through every subject about their oppression and about politics by making a math problem about gender, for instance. You see that happen today by doing a bingo on white privilege, by making having a reading assignment written by a Marxist somewhere, an oppressed individual. So children are being taught that they're oppressed or oppressor. That is happening, and that they're being taught to become social justice activists through every subject matter, and that is classic Freirean framework. That is what we're doing. That is what we're about to do, because that's culturally responsive instruction and social emotional learning.
Okay, and I see Paul's hands next. So thanks, Martha. Let's move on to Paul.
So I'm going to respond that my interest in this specifically is not so much personal, but that this country is being held captive by a narrative that is false. 1959, Black poverty rate was 55%. White poverty rate was 18.8%. 9 years later, the Black poverty rate fell 9% to 34.7%, and the white poverty rate fell to 10%, just 8.8%. Go 50 years, from 1968 to 2018, the Black poverty rate fell by another 14%. The white poverty rate went up a 0.1%. So this idea that this racism is stopping people from living their lives and working their way out of poverty is absolutely ridiculous. If you were born white and poor in the United States between 1959 and 2018, you were 3.5 times more likely to remain poor your entire life than a Black child born poor at the same time period. This is a false narrative that is being injected into our school and into our society, and it is dividing people. That's why I oppose it, because it's wrong. It's based on the political benefit of having Blacks and minorities vote for one party only based on a false narrative. People should get the right information and make decisions based on the facts, and that's US Census data, not mine. Those facts say that it does not exist.
Thanks, Paul. And we're going to let Dr. Jory have the last word on this. And again, the question is, do you think that critical race theory is being presented in any other form to allow it to be taught in the classroom in Prince William County schools?
Well, this is going to be again a tangent. I think it's more about what we want our students to become in the future. If we want them to be critical, if we want them to make responsible and informed contributions and decisions about the world, then we definitely need to lean into discomfort. And we cannot trivialize differences. And we need to teach the entire narrative of our current and historical times.
Thanks, Dr. Jory. And now we're going to move on to the next question. In the Committee of 100 interview with the superintendent, she indicated CRT is not in Prince William County schools because there are no classes explicitly taught on the topic. Critics argue that CRT is a lens that other subjects are taught through as a result of mandatory equity and diversity trainings for teachers. Can you comment on how and whether CRT is in the classroom? And that was a long one, so I'm happy to repeat it if any panelists need me to. Martha, I see your hand first.
I feel like a broken record a little bit. I'm as delicately as possible. I'm going to say that she gave a very disingenuous answer, because critical race theory is not taught, and I don't know anyone that claims that critical race theory is taught. Montessori schools have preschoolers that have Montessori theory implemented on them. They don't learn the Montessori theory. And the same thing is happening in Prince William County. Again, more so in our future. I know there's rogue teachers out there because I get told stories of what's happening in schools across the county, different assignments that come home, different conversations that are had. So, I think it's hard to find a young teacher today that is not indoctrinated into critical social justice. But it is absolutely being implemented in Prince William County schools through the things I keep mentioning, culturally responsive instruction and social emotional learning. And the superintendent knows that. And I can actually kind of prove that he knows that. So
And Atif, I see your hand. Do you want to respond?
Hey, Kate, and I'm so sorry that I'm not answering the questions directly because we're not asking the right questions. And I know that y'all are trying to do a good job to frame it. But again, why are people so worked up? Let's get to the bottom of that, right? Why are our friends Paul, Mr. Lott and Ms. Kutzinger and millions across America are so worked up? We can twist it, bend it, whatever, call it Marxism, whatever. The bottom line is people want fair treatment for different groups, whether it's based on race, sexual orientation, gender, religion, or whatever. And others want to resist. I mean, that's the heart of the problem. This is an iteration, like I said before, if you look at our history, this is no different than massive resistance, no different what's happening here. And like, we can deny it all we want, but if it looks like a duck, if it sounds like a duck, it's probably a duck.
Thanks, Atif. And I see your hand up, Paul, if you want to go ahead.
Fair treatment means that everyone is treated the same, not that everyone gets special treatment based upon where they come from or the color of their skin. People are getting worked up because they're seeing something that's wrong, and people aren't stupid. People can see that true equality is to lay out a table, equip your children, and let them go out and benefit based on their talents and abilities. This whole narrative that we have to have equality of outcomes is ridiculous. I am a father of 10 children, and with the same parents, I don't have 10 equal outcomes. Everyone prospered according to their talents, abilities, and desires. That's it. Equity, this notion of equity is—
Time's up. Sorry.
Oh, time's up.
I'm sorry.
And Dr. Jory, back to you again. The question again is, the superintendent of the district said that there isn't a specific class taught on CRT, but can you comment on whether you think CRT is or isn't taught in the classroom?
Well, the training is definitely about the topic of diversity and looking for opportunities to expand cultural proficiency, which entails that both students and teachers can understand different perspectives and build empathy. So, and it's a long drawn process, like transforming an organizational culture is definitely a long-term process that requires sustained focus and commitment. And I think, the county stakeholders are all invested in it.
Thanks, Dr. Jory. Moving on to the next question, and again, apologies, everyone, this is another long one. In 2019 and 2021, the Virginia Department of Education promoted a book titled "We Want to Do More Than Survive," which stated, lastly, teachers must embrace theories such as critical race theory, settler colonialism, Black feminism, disability, critical race studies, and other critical theories that have the ability to interrogate anti-Blackness. The Virginia Superintendent of Public Instruction also came under fire for memos in 2019 promoting critical race theory. What role has the Virginia Department of Education played in promoting CRT? And Atif, if you want to respond, I might let you go first since that co-occurred with your tenure as secretary.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think so. My Virginia Department of Education was one of my agencies. So for broader context, my oversight was over higher ed and K-12. And again, I don't think we're asking the right questions. I take ownership for everything that happened in the Department of Education, or whether, other colleges and universities, because they were under my secretariat. Again, we're not asking the right questions. Is that my question for my friends here is that, people have said that if you make school calendars more accommodating for different religious holidays, that's CRT. People have said that if you teach about more different groups like Asian Americans, Muslim Americans, Jewish Americans in our history curriculum, that's CRT. People have said that if you try to address facilities issues for transgender students, that's CRT. People have said that if you want to address school meals, principal is very, very diverse. And if you want to diversify your school meals, that's CRT. So those are the things that, I, been attacked for. So that's my question for folks is that, do you think that's CRT? All these things that we're trying to do to accommodate all different needs of different students?
Thanks, Atif. And Martha, I saw your hand first, so we can move to you if you want to respond.
Yeah, the book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, was written by Bettina Love, who we talked about earlier. She's an admitted Marxist, anti-capitalist, socialist, you name it. She bases her work again on Paulo Freire. So this is all consistent. And this absolutely was driven by Virginia Department of Education. Atif, maybe you weren't, the guy at the top doesn't always know what's going on underneath
I
him.
understand, but I take ownership of it. I didn't mean to cut you off. I take ownership of everything.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So it did happen under watch, and it is absolutely 100% designed for critical social justice activism to liberate the world around them, which means Marxist revolution. They call it liberation now, and it all comes from critical theory. And I want to correct you because it gives insight. The bathroom issue is actually critical queer theory, which is critical race theory and critical queer theory are the two aspects of critical social justice that are most affecting public education today.
And Paul, I see your hand. I feel bad. I'm always going to Dr. Jory last, so I'm going to give her the opportunity to respond, and then we'll finish with you. Dr. Jory, do you have an answer?
Sure. I think here we are talking about, preventing educators from challenging students. And I know that VEA has come up with their statement, and they're talking about the criticality of our students needing to learn about the times when this country has lived up to its promise and when it has not. And they expect honesty and transparency and critical analysis from us. And I think that's what we really need to live up to in our classrooms.
Great, thanks, Dr. Jory. And Paul, will end with you for this question.
I agree with Dr. Jory's principles, but I will say this. The best performing students in the country are from schools that are not immersed in race-based education. The most successful people that influence this country in terms of economics and business, et cetera, did not emerge from a race-based education. So to say that these things are necessary for a child to grow into a responsible, intelligent, and critically thinking adult is a bit disingenuous, because we have no data that says that that's the case. But we do know that these types of people have been coming out of public schools the entire time. Okay. I think it has to do with time and priority. Rigor can be academic exclusively and have the proper benefits to the children without the sideshow, without all of the extra stuff. And to address the idea of what quote unquote people say is critical race theory or not critical race theory, that doesn't matter. There are people that are not very educated about what CRT is and how it functions in the school. There are people that are confused about it. There are people that will communicate it in the wrong way. But what parents do know is when their child comes home and starts to talk about ideas that go against their family and personal morality, that's a problem. And the tenets that are put in the system from CRT, from critical race theory and race-based teaching, violates the moral teachings of many parents. And
it's dinging.
Content.
Thanks, Sherry. And thanks, Paul.
I just want to make one statement, if that's okay.
Yeah, Dr. Jory, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to state that rigor cannot be implemented in a void. and it definitely needs, a robust curriculum. That's all.
Thanks.
I agree with that. That's true.
And a sort of related question, Prince William County Schools recently hired a chief equity officer who leads a new 10-person department. In an Inside Nova article, she described her role as proactively influencing other departments. How will this department influence how the division handles CRT and other related topics? Martha, I saw your hand first, so go ahead.
So you can think of an equity director or an equity officer as a political officer, a political commissar. She will be ensuring that equity is carried out in every place within Prince William County Schools. And whether not just academically, in hiring, in all kinds of ways. And, if anybody else read that article, she's not talking about what she's doing. She's not talking about how she's using her $1.8 million budget. It's a travesty. It's a lot of teacher raises that could come out of that money. And it is going to be squandered on programs that do nothing but divide and dismantle and deconstruct and frankly, take away from students quality education that they have been getting in Prince William County to this point.
Thanks, Martha. And do any of our other panelists want to chime in?
Can you repeat the question again? I think I missed what.
Sure.
Oh, what the impact of the department will be. Is that right?
Yes, of a chief equity officer who now leads a 10-person department in Prince William County Schools. And I saw Tiff's hand, so we'll go to him. And then Paul, we can move to you if you want to respond.
Yeah, and not to irritate Mr. Lott and Ms. Cutsinger, and others on the line, but I think it's a great idea. Again, I think, we're asking the wrong questions, Kate, and I'm sorry, I keep repeating that. People have made up their minds on the two sides of the issue, right? I mean, these battles are happening at the ballot box. We saw what happened in the recent election with Governor Youngkin. Same conversation are happening in Texas, same are happening in Florida, across the country and so forth, especially in battleground states, where again, we want to talk about politics. This is a manufactured crisis by the Republican Party because it's red meat to turn out a base that is vitriolic and hateful. This is an iteration of the past. I cannot emphasize that enough. So let's come to terms with what's really happening here. This is really this anti-CRT movement, anti-DEI movement, anti-whatever movement is really to suppress voices that want to think critically and ask questions that how can we do better as a society?
Thanks for that, Atif. And Paul, would you like to respond?
So the first thing is that what will come out of it's put there to institutionalize into the organization the propagation of CRT-esque ideas. Now, you keep talking about the wrong question. This is the right question. Does the money spent result in children graduating from school knowing more, being more proficient in reading and math, and better equipped to take on a career or an advanced education? This equity department and 10 people, that pot of money could best be spent for tutors and other direct aid to children and underperforming children, and specifically are children with disabilities in education.
Hands up.
So that's the right question. And the answer is no, it does not. It should not be there.
Thanks, Paul. And Dr. Jory, would you like to have the last word on this?
I can't fathom and kind of understand the rationale for these pockets of resistance toward this initiative. Equity is definitely what we need in our county. And it's a promise to, it's a promise of ensuring that historically marginalized population is served.
All right, thanks for that. And moving on to the next question. Hold on, let me find the right pop-up. What effect do you think teaching critical race theory would have on students, pros and cons? Paul, do you want to jump in?
I know what effects it had in the black, it has had in the Black community: high black dropout rates, lower academic performance, lower academic motivation. And this is not hyperbole. I grew up in these communities. I've worked in these communities. The tenets of CRT are highly destructive. There is no positive side to it. I will say this: most people that advocate these things have never seen the effects that they have in my community in urban poverty clusters. Prince William County, from where I come from, is an extremely wealthy place. And this is an experiment in Northern Virginia, but the end result is lower performance. I don't see anything positive about teaching people that America is systemically racist. You know, Blacks who come from other countries who have never been taught that don't have any of the problems of Blacks born here who are always taught that. The discrimination doesn't stop them at all. Asian Americans have the same poverty rate as white Americans. So obviously race is not that big of a deal unless we make it that big of a deal. Just my 2 cents.
I saw Martha's hand next, so we'll move to her and then we'll go to Atif.
Am I, oh yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay. If you go back to the Freirean doctrine, which is in place today, education is designed to be used to awaken the oppressed to their oppression. That, as Paul has noted, that takes away from their useful information. They spend time on I'm going to go back to privilege bingo and some of the math problems that focus on gender more so than math. China is teaching their high schoolers to code. We are focused on teaching children that they're oppressed or that there is an oppressor sitting next to them. There are efforts within schools to create affinity groups, which means segregation, self-enforced segregation, so that you can be with someone who looks like you. This effort to bring in teachers that look like their students. I doubt that Ms. Jory's students all look like her. That doesn't mean that she shouldn't be able to teach them, but that's the direction that equity is taking us. But it is, you have to remember, the goal is not to benefit the student. Calling a child by its preferred pronoun is not to the benefit of the student. It is for the long-term goal of social justice activism and liberation. And Secretary Carney keeps saying, well, we teach communism, why can't we teach this? Well, actually, we don't teach enough about communism and Marxism. Our students don't know enough about the 100 million people that were killed in the 20th century. They don't understand that the methods being used on them today are methods that Mao used in his Cultural Revolution. So we're not implementing Marxism like you kind of are indicating we are by saying we're teaching it. But ironically, we are implementing it because we are starting to use foundations of critical race theory, the ideologies, through culturally responsive instruction and social emotional learning. So in the end, they're getting a lesser education because of it.
Yeah, sorry.
And I'll let Atif respond, and then we'll go to Dr.
Sure.
Jory.
No, absolutely. And I think that, I think we should teach more about, as much as possible, so our students are knowledgeable about the atrocities committed under different communist regimes. I think we should teach more about all the atrocities committed in America in our history, which we don't do a good job of, right? What truly happened during Jim Crow, what truly happened during massive resistance, but folks will say that's CRT. So that's what I'm saying, is that I'm just hearing conflicting information. Look, Ms. Kunsinger and Mr. Lott are extremely intelligent, extremely disciplined. They are not answering the questions I'm posing. I know I'm being annoying because I don't believe the right questions are being asked. But again, my question is, why are people so worked up about this? Because we really haven't truly answered it. What is the true intention? Like, I feel like the intention is to keep people not questioning if things are okay. It's a big problem. I mean, please do reflect on what I'm saying.
And Dr. Jory, would you like to end this question?
Sure. So if you want to implement or incorporate equitable access to rigorous courses, access to high levels of support, expertise, and move away from this concept of lowering expectations for marginalized students, then we need to move into the culturally responsive framework.
Thanks for that. And then moving on to our last committee question, also related. Is there a way to teach about the diverse backgrounds and cultures that Prince William County students come from without what some believe are the negatives of critical race theory? If not critical race theory, then what? And Dr. Jory, since we always end with you, do you want to start with this one?
Sure. I think it's we need to trust our educators. They're professionally trained, and we need to definitely give them that space to navigate and make instructional decisions for their students. And definitely, we need to integrate curriculum that intertwines everyone's voice so that our students feel validated and are represented in what's being taught. And I think, we're kind of in this nebulous zone of, pushing teachers to really reevaluate what they're going to teach at this point. And that's a heavy burden on an educator, because an educator definitely understands and has a nuanced understanding of their students and their skill levels. We've been talking about reading skills, their lexical, their lexile levels, their proficiencies, and their passions and their needs as well. And we are talking about not just the external manifestation of all of those, but then internally, are we able to connect with the students? And if we are going to completely deplete our curriculum of multiple voices, then we have already alienated ourselves from them. And I feel that's ethically wrong for an educator.
Thanks, Dr. Jory. And Paul, I saw your hand next, if you want to chime in.
Sure. How is it done? I lived in Maine for a while when my kids were young. They simply had a week-long heritage festival. Parents came in, presented about their backgrounds. They talked about the ethnic backgrounds, histories, cultures. They shared all that stuff, and it covered everyone and just got it out of the way. And they went back to focusing on core competence, the core academic competencies. I think the problem we have here is there's an emotional argument versus a factual argument. Stanford University in 2016 did a broad study on whether or not there are significant or actual academic improvements by embracing things like SEL, CRI, et cetera, et cetera. The result, and this was not a right-wing university, the result of the study was this, that we don't know, we don't have any data to show that it has any substantial results. Where there are results, there's usually some academic rigor program in parallel, and there's no control group in order to test whether or not this way grades go up versus this way grades go up. So our children are being used in an experiment because there is no data at all. I've looked. I took 6 weeks to try to find it, me and my staff. It does not exist to show that these things actually produce real adult level outcomes. And I think we need to ask the right question and get out of the weeds and set aside our emotions and say, this is what our schools are here for. This is what the parents all agree that they're here for. And there are those things that parents don't agree that they're here for. And those things should be excluded. And we should focus on what we have in common and build on that. That's how you build a better country, a better America, a better family, better children. I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks,
But
Paul.
doctor, I love you.
I saw Martha's hand next, so we'll go to her, and then Atif will have the last word on this question. So Martha, go ahead.
Okay, so this is a kind of question that is difficult to answer because it makes me understand that the person asking it doesn't really understand what critical race theory is. So instead of trying to explain 100 years of how we got here, I mean, that's really what you have to start to do, is you have to go back and try to understand the history of critical race theory, which comes from critical race theory, which comes from the Frankfurt School, which comes from Marx and Hegel. So it is a complex, complicated, the hours I've spent, and I think Paul too, trying to understand how we got here, I can't do in 90 seconds, but critical race theory is not about multiculturalism. It's not. It's another avenue by critical theorists to dismantle Western culture. It was they figured out another way to do it, and they're very successful. They're winning. This has been around since the 1960s, really, when Derek Bell first started critical legal studies. And I just want to address Secretary Carney and say that, and answer your question, we're worked up about this because, and I wrote it down, because we're worked up about the fact that teachers and students are being indoctrinated into social justice activism for socialist revolution. That is the stated goal of critical social justice, critical race theory, critical queer theory, all of them. I think everyone should be worked up about it, but it's coming in subtle, so people don't recognize it. And people think it's, you're racist to fight it, or you're homophobic to fight it, or you don't want, you just don't want to teach about slavery. None of that is.
Thank you. That's a fair point, Ms. Kunstinger. Please call me Atif. I want to be thoughtful in this response. So if I go over my time, I apologize. But I think you do raise a profound point about the intent and the Marxism. I get all that, but the folks who are actually really concerned, like I was in my position, I taught in Dale City for 10 years in Prince William County, know Prince William County really, really well. This is even before I became Secretary of Education, but even when I was Secretary of Education, I had access to a lot of information and data. And we talk about data, well, let's talk about data. In Prince William, whether it's the East End or the West End, Black children across the county, whether they're affluent or not, are still 3 times more likely to get a discipline referral compared to their peers, right? That's data set. That's something that Virginia Tech did a study. That's not my numbers making up. You can go look at it. That was issued by JLARC, by a Republican legislator. It was done statewide, right? So that's one example. After Donald Trump got elected, a registrar, what used to be Stonewall Jackson High School's Unity Reed, sent out a letter to 300 families asking for children to produce their documentation status. There was a series of attacks on Muslim girls in our schools where their hijabs were being yanked off in multiple schools. I actually, matter of fact, did a big round table at the mosque with our superintendent. Actually, school board had to address it because it was happening. So systematically, a lot of these things happened with COVID. I got numerous complaints from across the county in Prince William about Asian American children were getting bullied. So these oppressive things happen. We just can't deny them. They're evident. These are facts that lead to looking for good solutions. So when we talk about, let's get rid of DEI, let's not talk about social emotional learning, let's not talk about all these other things, and we tie that into CRT and conflate these things, that is disingenuous.
Time's up.
Thanks, Sherry. And I'll leave it to you and Cynthia. Do we have time to get to a few audience questions?
I don't think we've been able to get to any of them yet, but Van, have you sent any?
Yeah, I have a few ready to go if we want to take a few.
Okay, well, it's up to Cynthia.
Let's take a few, please. Let's take a few.
Okay. And I think some of them have been pretty thoroughly answered at this point. But one, and I know that Paul has answered a few of them by text as well, but for everyone's benefit, one of the first ones that came into me, in response to Paul Lott's statement that schools should teach only reading, writing, and math, I'm wondering what students should read and write about. If they don't read history or literature, I'm confused about what's left beyond Dick and Jane. And Paul, since that was addressed to you, do you want to respond first?
He's
I'm
already
going
answered.
to say that the answer to that question is this: is the way that, say, history is put together done perfectly now? No. Is the way that these forces are trying to push history, leaning particularly on, slavery, et cetera, is that the right way to go? My answer is going to be no. I do think that we need to take a fresh look at a unifying curricula and approach to things. And I'll give you an example. Me, myself, when I was in school, I was taught that the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution was a sign of American racism. So I thought that they were saying, and I believe most of my life, that the Constitution said that my race was 3/5 human, until I got into college and read it again. And it basically was a mechanism in the Constitution to undermine slavery by limiting congressional representation of the slave states so that they could not take control of Congress. And that provision allowed the legislature to put restriction upon restriction upon restriction on slavery. And that is what led to it being eventually stamped out. It started with the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, where the founders understood that things were not perfect, that everyone didn't agree, but they put mechanisms in place to work it out, right? And that's that. So my response would be, yeah, we need to take a look at curricula. We need to take a look at some of the crazy false things that are put in, but we cannot go the other way and embrace, this narrative that America was founded in 1619 based on racism, and et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of truths out there that keep getting missed. And both sides, in my opinion, are missing them. I'm a huge history buff, and I can tell you that a lot of what comes out on both sides is a lot of hooey. So in terms of, but I think the target should be, we should always respect parents. And if there's a plurality of parents that object to a particular material, we need to find a material that all parents can work with, because the key to a good student is a good parent. Parents are the key to education. And if we take steps that put obstacles against parental authority, that system will fail. Schools don't, how can I say it? Schools don't really fail. Families fail. You don't have high levels of failure where families are doing well. You have high levels of failure where families are not doing well. And so schools should not embrace any policy that causes this level of parental conflict. It doesn't matter if the parents are right or wrong. It's their kids and they're the parents. So that's, I think, where that agreement needs to come. Let the parents come together with the teachers and agree on what the books are. And if race-based or sex-based material is something that causes a lot of pain to the parents, it needs to go. It is not the position of the academic. A teacher's credentials and background does not trump a parent's right to controlling the education of their child, period. Teachers need to trust the parents, and they don't. That's part of the problem.
And Paul, I'll let, do any other panelists want to chime in on this question?
Cynthia said we have 5 more minutes.
Yeah, let me just say, yeah, we're really running overtime. I'd like to wrap it up. If there are closing statements that our panelists would like to make for a minute or so, let's do that. But we really do need to wrap it up, and maybe we can have another one of these sessions in the future. But let's look at wrapping it up at this point.
Sure. Well, Adif, I saw your hand up. So do you want to move on to your response and closing statement, and then we'll move on to the other
I'll just do a
panelists?
closing statement. Yeah, that's fine. Because it's almost 9, and sorry, I've had a lot of these conversations and really listened and reflected. And again, and I'll bite that, hey, I understand a true nervousness about spreading Marxism in America. I get that piece. But again, I think the conflation of that social emotional supports, addressing school nutrition, addressing just culture, embracing different cultures, the conflation of that is a big problem. And one thing that really, really bothers me is this mini insurrections happening in school boards across America, including Fairfax, Loudoun, including in Prince William, but people are foaming at their mouths, threatening school board members. They're getting death threats. Superintendents are getting death threats. Teachers are being attacked who happen to be parents, many of the teachers. I'm a parent as well. And not, I know Youngkin ran on this whole pay parents, but what parents are we talking about? Because there's parents on both sides of the issue. So I think that people really need to reflect and look in their inner soul that what is their true intention. Please do that. I'm not trying to name call here and so forth. I really think we need to do this because I fear the biggest threat right now is this anti-CRT movement that's really rotting our country and eroding our country. It's not the other side. It's this hate and vitriol for the other and anybody speaking out for fair treatment. So please do reflect on that.
And I think I heard Martha trying to chime in earlier. So Martha, do you want to go ahead with your closing statements?
I'm going to take back the screen again because I do have one more thing I want to show. And I need to. Okay, so you will not be surprised to hear that my bottom line is, do we want a Marxist framework for education used in Prince William County schools? Do you want students to focus on activism or academics? There is evidence of the damage done in places like the Adena Public Schools in Minnesota. 6 years and millions spent on what we are about to do, and their outcome gaps have stayed the same or widened, and math and reading scores have suffered. We shouldn't be having a conversation about whether or not critical race theory is embedded in Prince William schools. That is the iceberg ahead, and it's irrefutable. So the discussion we should be having is, do we want a Marxist framework being used in K-12 education for social justice activism? Listen to Ms. Burgos, Prince William Director of Equity and formerly of Prince William County Schools.
I've been here. It's inclusion for everyone.
Okay,
everyone.
You're implementing a Marxist framework.
Well, understand the Marxist framework, and you'll understand that how it's used in education, psychology, sociology today. Not all of it.
So you're admitting that it is used.
Not all of it, but that would imply that there is parts of it used. What parts are used?
Look at it up. Read it yourself.
Well, I mean, you seem to know, so could you just tell me? You seem to know.
Sociology, education.
Okay, Ms. Burgos, she admitted it.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Well, understand the Marxist framework, and you'll understand that how it's used in education, psychology.
I am not the one claiming that it's a Marxist framework. The people implementing it are admitting it.
And thanks for that, Martha. Dr. Jory, can we move to you for your closing statements?
Firstly, I would just like to respond to Mr. Lott about certain books that should not be taught. I feel a lot of books are misleadingly labeled, and if we want our students to look beyond their personal experiences, we need to expose them to books written by people of color. And two decades ago, only 9% of children's books published in the US were about people of color. And in 2016, only 12% of children's books were created by authors and illustrators of color. That's data in itself. But I wanted to end my presentation with an excerpt, a student's essay excerpt to the prompt: discuss how your past experiences will inform your future decision-making. As a child, my Uncle Kurt always told me, you have strong blood. At first, I never understood what that really meant because I was too young to understand this concept. Growing up in a Native American household, I was exposed to the many cultural teachings that shaped my identity. Personally, the story of the changing woman is my favorite. Changing woman, mother of the Navajo people, creates a beautiful view of the creation of life. She teaches the meaning of beauty, individuality, and the importance of fortitude. I held those teachings dear to me in times of distress and solitude, times when I sat concerned for my future in court waiting rooms, times when I felt captive and cuffed in a cop car, times when I felt nostalgic about the time I spent with my father who abandoned me in my childhood. But it's that strong blood that kept my head held high. And I'll leave by saying that, yes, we are obliged to leverage our proximity to students and listen to their narratives and sub-narratives and ensure equitable outcomes for all our students. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Jory. And Paul, we'll move to you to close things out.
Probably shouldn't say this publicly, but equity is not a natural construct. Survival of the fittest is the natural construct. And at the end of the day, everything will fall within that paradigm. Now, we cannot help the deer by breaking the leg of the lion. We have to help the deer run faster. Our students, when they leave school, they're not going to go into a quote unquote equitable society, because that's just impossible. We know it's impossible. Humanity has tried it forever. It's never worked. We have no working models. But what we do have is a working model of in our system today where everyone has equal opportunity. Equal opportunity, not equity of outcomes. First thing, our education system has to respect parents, period. Even when the system disagrees with parents, parents need to come first. It is their children. The Supreme Court has ruled numerous times that children are not the property of the state. Therefore, you do not have the right to decide against broad parental wishes a curricula, a book, or whatever it is. Now, parents in Prince William deciding on books doesn't mean that they don't want Black authors. That's a huge jump. Just that having a Black author, no one has gone to a library debating whether or not who wrote the book and the race of the person who wrote the book. They've talked about CRT content, race-based content, sex-based content, et cetera, et cetera. That's what they've talked about. No one's ever gone and protested in Prince William County since I've been here that a book is in the library that was written by a Black person or a person of color. So that is an invalid argument. We need to, when you have a problem with the complex system, the way you fix it is to go back to its fundamentals. When a business is having problems, they sell off their additional divisions and they move back to their core business and they make sure they get their core business right. Prince William County needs to focus on its core business and not take on these conflicts that cause problems with parents, whether or not it's due to misunderstanding or not. It is not the parent's obligation to automatically trust the schools or to understand you. It is the school system's obligation, who are paid by the parents' money through their taxes, are elected by these parents. It is their responsibility to be responsive to parents, not vice versa. That has to stop. And that's what's destroying our
Sherry.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And I'm going to kick it back to Cynthia. I know that we had more questions, but unfortunately we have to conclude. So Cynthia, if you want to close things out.
Thank you. And I apologize that we can't get to all the questions. Maybe what that means is that we'll have to have a part 2 to this discussion, because I have really enjoyed and been enlightened by all the different perspectives. We just can't even get to all the questions that we have. We apologize for that. I want to thank you, panelists, each one of you, for being here with us tonight and sharing your valuable time. Kate Masters, thank you. You have been wonderful as our moderator. We appreciate the moderation you've done for this group. I would just like to say that the Committee of 100 will be sponsoring its annual meeting on May the 19th, actually the same day that we will be recognizing citizens in Prince William County who have offered outstanding contributions to our community. Certainly, we couldn't get to everyone, but on May 19th, we'll have a double objective. One would be to have our annual meeting in which we'll introduce new officers for the Committee of 100 for the year coming. And number two will be to recognize citizens in Prince William County who have made outstanding contributions to the county in different ways. So we invite you all to be with us for that. As we close, let me thank Denny Doherty, who is not only our program chair, but he also has been the coordinator for this program and is the reason that we've had such a wonderful discussion tonight. We thank the Questions Committee led by Willie Deutsch. You've done a masterful job of presenting us with questions that are very thoughtful and that really help clarify some things for us. So, ladies and gentlemen of the panel, thank you so much for being with us. Special thanks to you for pitching in at the last minute in light of the cancellation that we had. Thank you so much for being here with us. Okay, and with that, I'd like to bid you a good night and stay tuned for the next Committee of 100 event. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.